All right, some things to think about as we're thinking through sexual ethics, and this applies to any other of our dicey issues. You can see that I titled this presentation, Ideas on Optimal Morality in a 2PDB World, Two Prostitutes and a Dead Baby World. And as you're learning, as we move through these issues, the question isn't necessarily, is this right or wrong? That question, probably everything we do, we should be like Martin Luther and say is at some level very wrong. On the other hand, we still have a life we have to live the best possible way, given that we got dealt a hand that includes two prostitutes and a dead baby. So as we're thinking through these issues, I think as we're thinking through homosexuality, the question that's not as important is, is homosexuality a sin? The important question is, how do we live in a world, and I'm talking specifically about a faith community now, Christian people, how do we live with other Christians who are homosexuals? And what is required? How do we form our communities and govern our communities? And that's where I'm coming back to my idea of how to spell cat and writer and wronger. Remember, we started the semester with that, and I've tried to draw what I might draw on the board. And we're on some sort of continuum toward shalom. I mean, the Christian community, at least, that's what we're saying, is that we are heading toward shalom. And so we are interested in, let me move my picture, what is holy and makes us live in a state of peace with God and with ourselves and delight and joy. Now, you can see I've got some different circles up here where there is the right spelling of cat, but there are some close seconds. And that doesn't mean that they're exactly right. It does mean that that's as close to shalom as we can get with that particular letter combination. Think Scrabble, and that's the hand you've been dealt. So then for the people in my church, let's use my church as an example. Probably your church is very, very similar. People are coming in with all sorts of dysfunctions and brokenness. They don't have a CAT in their little Scrabble dish. They have maybe an LPQ. And we're just trying to sort out some of those letters and get them to a place where they can approximate something that's more holy and more shalomy. And so we're rejoicing if they can move from SOW up to HAT, hat. And then, so let's think about someone in my community, let's say, who comes in and they're schizophrenic. They're short of a miracle, which God can do and occasionally does, but not all that often, unfortunately. Short of a miracle, they will always be schizophrenic. So then we have to ask the question, not, is it okay to be schizophrenic? No, it's not God's intention for us to have broken brains. That's the whammy that sin did on our brains. The question is, how do we live in faithful community with people who have broken brains? Understanding that my brain is broken and every one of your brains is broken to some degree, but maybe not the degree of a schizophrenic who's, severely ill. So then we have to ask the question, what does holiness look like for that person today? Or think of my addicts. What does holiness look like for that person today? So then holiness looks different for Carlos, my schizophrenic brother at church, than it does for Rich, who's not schizophrenic. He has a different set of brokennesses, but it just looks different. So that's where I'm wondering if this model, does it help us? I don't know that it does, but I'm putting it out there. Does it help us in thinking about sexuality and sexual ethics? Ideally, everybody gets dealt a hand that says you're cisgendered, that means body and brain line up, heterosexual, attractive enough to get married, right? Because there are many heterosexual cisgendered people who aren't married, or you have the right personality for marriage, or you have a spouse who's faithful to their covenants and all that. So, I mean, that's the ideal. It's probably what most people would want. But if you didn't get that hand, is there a close second that we could say, this is better than that? This is better than some alternatives? Or do we say, if you cannot achieve cat, there's no possibility of being in the holy body? And that's a difficult question. And so when we're thinking about homosexuality, if we're telling a person, hey, cat either is single and celibate forever or heterosexual married forever, anything short of that just can't be in our body. I'm concerned about that. Back in the olden days, if you got divorced, because the norm, the holiness was a man and a woman married for life, and divorce was the deal breaker. You were no longer in the right status, and so you could be excommunicated, disfellowshipped. And then, of course, issues of remarriage became problematic. If you remarry, are you a perpetual adulterer? Can you be in the body? Can you serve in the church? Could you be a pastor? Up until the 1990s, if you were divorced and remarried, you could not be a professor at Cal Baptist. And then finally, we changed that. So just some interesting questions we have to ask. So when I'm thinking about my gay brothers and sisters, they are Christians. They love the Lord. I want to be real clear. Your sexual orientation does not prevent or help you in salvation. Homosexual people are as in need of salvation as heterosexual people are, and are as savable as heterosexual people are, right? So there's no qualifications for salvation based on our sexual orientation. The only qualification for our salvation is that we are sinners and we recognize our need and we look to Christ and he meets the need. So let's be clear on that. So then the question is, what does the life of sanctification look like for gay people? We have to ask the same question of what does the life of sanctification look like for heterosexual people, for single people, for married people. There are burdens to singleness and there are burdens to marriage. And we, as a faith community, have said we will commit to helping you bear the burden of singleness. We commit to help you bear the burden of marriage. We say that. We also say we will commit to help you bear the burden of mental illness, but my schizophrenic brothers and sisters have not always found that to be very true. So I think the better question that we could think about is, how can the church bear the burdens of homosexuality and heterosexuality with people who are not finding fulfillment in life through healthy, happy marriages? So coming back to my other ways of spelling cat, K-A-T, and something close but not quite hat, the next question I want to ask is, if a gay person said, I really cannot in any way see myself being okay, single and celibate my whole life. It's not the gift given to me. And Paul really does remind us that singleness and celibacy is a gift, as is marriage. So if someone says, no, I've not seen that the Spirit of God has granted me that gift, I need to be in a marriage relationship, is it better than to say, well, okay, you can be married, but to only one person. You still have to be faithful to the covenant, the commitment. So in this way of thinking, and I'm not taking the stand, I'm just putting out these ideas and people I've talked to. I've spent hours and hours talking with different folks on these issues. Recently went to a great conference where it was just an open discussion of church leaders about how to proceed in a gracious conversation. But could we consider that the issue that God is most concerned about is actually faithfulness to the covenant, because it models God's faithfulness? In which case, then we would say to gay people, you may marry as an accommodation to our human need for intimacy and marriage. It's good. It's not good for man to be alone, right? You don't have to be heterosexual or homosexual to know that it's not good for man to be alone. So if we were to accommodate and say, okay, if the best you can do is be married to the same, then at least be married in a proper way. Be legally married so that you have all the responsibilities of married people too. Because we always think of marriage as a great privilege. It is a great privilege, but it's also a great responsibility. I now have to share half my stuff all the time legally. And I have legal obligations and moral obligations to my husband that I don't have to anybody else. And so there's burdens to that also. So some churches are saying, okay, this is how we will adapt and accommodate, is allow marriage, same-sex marriage, but it has to be a holy marriage. And when we're thinking about marriage, think about heterosexual marriages that are just violent or mean or hard-hearted toward one another. I know of a husband and wife, very proper in every way, but they are so at odds, and they would never get divorced because divorce is a sin. But they are so at odds that probably for the last 17 years, they've never had sex. They just can't stand each other, and the wife says, oh, you're not a godly man, and I can't respect you, and blah, blah, blah. And anyway, so then there's been this complete breakdown of normal goodwill and sexual expression of that goodwill in their marriage. Now, that doesn't strike me as a whole lot better. In fact, it strikes me as a potentially very much worse than two people who are in a covenant of goodwill and love toward one another and who are faithful to that, because that is a form of unfaithfulness. I said I would give you my best of my time, the best of my energy, the best of my goodwill, and now I'm withholding that. That's not a faithful marriage either. So I think one thing to think about is, as we're thinking of marriage and what makes a holy marriage or holier, understanding that until eternity, when interestingly we think there may not be marriage in our eternal life, until then we're all just kind of accommodating some problems. So anyway, it just gets me thinking about an ethic of accommodation. If you think that sounds weird, go and read in the Gospels. A couple different Gospels record where Jesus has some conversation. His disciples are there, and I think there's some Pharisees there. I'll have to pull it up and really read it. But they say, how come God told Moses he commanded divorce? And Jesus says, God didn't command divorce. He permitted it. He's not promoting it. He's permitting it. Even after he had forbidden it, he said, it's against God. God hates divorce. What God has joined together, let no man tear asunder. And yet, Jesus says, God permitted it because you had hard hearts, to accommodate the wickedness of people. And so he put in divorce decrees that at least made some protections for people who were going to be abandoned by their spouse, and said, hey, if the husband is, only men could issue divorce. Women didn't get to say who they married and who divorced them. But God said to Moses, put in some safeguards so that when these women are sent away, they at least have some protection. So it's interesting. God didn't just say no divorce and leave it there. He said, well, since you are going to be divorcing, at least make it humane. So I'm wondering if we should think through that as an ethic of accommodation. All right, those are my musings for today. I'll check in with you later.